Welcome to another episode of Music Pro Musings with Danny J. Lewis. Now, in this episode, I'm going to talk about the incredible amount of change in terms of the process of making music. And I'm going to do so by just kind of recalling a lot of my personal journey in that world. Now, in my teenage years, I'm 55 years old, right? So my teenage years were the 80s, okay? So when I was 18, it was 1988. A really, really important year, which was, the whole kind of acid house period. I was very lucky to be around in that time. Now, at that age, I was not making music, and I had no leanings towards music. What I was doing was very visual. I was doing art A-level, I was doing design and technology A-level. They were the subject areas that I was into. And my plan was to go off and do something like product design at university and do a intermediate stage of getting a foundation course in art and design. Now, what happened was that the whole clubbing thing, the whole kind of underground world, started to become appealing. And it was something that I didn't really understand at that point in time in 88. I started working in a record shop to earn some money whilst in my later time at the school. And I started importing lots of really incredible music that was so inspiring to me. Acid house in its early phases, Armando, Adonis, these were productions that were just blowing my mind. It was like music from another planet. So it inspired me. I just, as a kind of punter, a clubber, I wanted to hear it properly. In those days, I was going to what I would probably class as commercial clubbing, and that's going to the Hammersmith Palais. Hearing Bobby Brown, Alexander O'Neill, this was clubbing, but you had to dress up smart. You had to wear a shirt and tie, and it was a very stale experience for me. Even though I loved going out and socializing and dancing and being involved in that world with the flashing lights and everything, I think it was very appealing. And as someone who has now become diagnosed as neurodiverse, I understand that world felt comfortable in terms of it felt like it was home. The whole idea of the flashing lights and the music, the repetition, that kind of thing can work very well for neurodiverse people. So something just wasn't right. And what happened was there were songs that were kind of veering into that territory, into the underground world, that did get in the charts, that did occasionally get played at a house at Palais. And I remember there were a couple of girls that I got to know, and they said to me, right, come with us next week. We'll show you another world. And I was like, okay, let's see what this is. Where does it lead to? And we ended up at the Astoria, Charing Cross Road, and this is in the West End. And we went to a night called Sin. And I didn't have to wear a shirt and tie. I could wear comfortable clothes. And I will never forget walking into that place. And it was like a revelation. This was my home. I felt like I'd literally got to where I needed to be. The music was everything that I wanted. The vibe, the atmosphere was everything that I wanted as well. The people, the way they dressed, there was this whole kind of style. My hair wasn't quite right to fit in with that scene. It's so funny. And I ended up, everybody will laugh at this. I did actually have hair in those days, and I grew my hair pretty long, almost down to my shoulders, because that was the look, it was the style. And so, I felt initially out of place, but gradually felt more at place over time. So going out to those events and eventually going to the big M25 parties, Sunrise, Energy, all these kind of things, that whole kind of rave period, very, very influential time. And what happened was that I started to lose interest in the design and the art. In fact, I got a place on the art foundation course that I didn't take up. And I literally paused that kind of area of my life and focused entirely on the music. So, I was working in the record shop, I was going out to all these events, and these girls, and I'll name check them because they were very important to me, as Louisa and Emma. And honestly, they introduced me to this world, which has been such an important thing, so I would always be thankful for their place in my life for that. But what happened was, relationships, they come and go, and we ended up kind of parting ways. And then for me, also, the music kind of shifted. It was the early days of, I guess, the kind of breaks sound, which at that point in time, I didn't enjoy so much as the kind of forward to the floor thing. The scene kind of shifted for me. So I did kind of lose interest, but I did start to get things appearing in my head, kind of musical ideas. And they started forming. I didn't know what to do with them. It was really frustrating. I went through possibly one of the worst periods of my life from a kind of a job and career perspective, because I was being told by my parents that I needed to do something more serious than just working in a record shop. So I ended up getting a job as a trainee building surveyor. It was, on reflection, horrific, because I was kind of forced into a box where I absolutely did not belong. I felt like a total, utter alien, but I persisted with it because I thought it was the right thing to do. At that age, I didn't know that there were jobs in the music business that potentially I could do. I had no idea. I had no connections to that world. I was isolated, surrounded by what I would class as kind of normal people. I was not normal. So in a way that kind of exaggerated all of these ideas in my head. I guess it was an emotional response that these ideas were coming as a reaction to being stuck in that normality. And I wasn't going to those clubs anymore. So what happened was I started playing around. My brother had got a Yamaha PSS 780 keyboard for his birthday, and I started messing around with it, just playing notes. It was an FM, I think maybe the 780 is not the right number, but anyway, I remember him having an FM style keyboard first, and then another one that was more kind of sample based. Very primitive, very low quality. So I was playing around with the FM keyboard. I was even getting in and creating sounds using FM. So that was where the urge started coming, but the quality of the sound, it just wasn't good enough. And I didn't know what I was doing. I was just kind of feeling my way around the notes without having any formal training. I just had no idea. So I was just kind of enjoying the ability to create sound. And I just felt really frustrated again because it sounded nothing like those amazing club tunes that I knew. So then I started just trying to read and understand what was going on with this world. And remember, these days, there was no internet, and the only way you could find out this information was through reading or by knowing people that could pass on knowledge. But I'll come on to that in a minute. A lot of people were very, very reluctant to pass on knowledge. So I was reading Sound on Sound magazine, going into Smith's, W.H. Smith's, and spending time in there just reading the magazine. It was expensive. I couldn't really afford it in those days. And I would just spend time just trying to understand what it was all about. And I saw all this equipment, this amazing gear that people were using to make music, but it was so obscenely expensive. I was a kid who was, from a family that separated. I was living on a council estate for a while. Then I moved to another council house. We went from a privileged background. So it was about, how on earth am I going to do this? Everybody has to spend so much money. It was insane. I couldn't believe it. So what I ended up doing was finding some music stores where they were selling secondhand gear. And in a way, what's amazing here is the parallel with, the early days of acid house. It was the guys in Chicago, they had these bassline, the TB303, the Roland product that was just not selling and nobody bought it. So it was going cheap in secondhand stores. So I started looking for cheap secondhand gear that I could use to try and start pushing my production, because I knew that things didn't sound right. And then I was like, why do they not sound right? I remember buying an Alesis SR16 cheap, and it didn't sound. I thought it was a drum machine that was going to give me all those sounds that I knew, but it didn't. It was much more along the lines of realistic drum sounds. And I guess for me, the turning point was realizing that the majority of people on the house scene were using the Roland 909, and some were using the 808. And that was a revelation for me when I started to understand that and to recognize those sounds, because that was the thing about training my ears to identify these sounds. Then I realized I needed to get those samples. And then it was, I don't have a sampler. How do I do this? But I did have a Commodore Amiga, which had the ability to sample sound. And if you bought a cartridge, a cheap cartridge, you could get audio signal going in. Now, when I started, it was insane. I don't understand the technical reasons why, but to get a stereo signal was impossible because I'd sample something, I'd play one note, it would play on the far left, I'd play another note, it would play on the left, I'd play another one, it would go to the right, and then go to the right. It was this weird alternating. So I bought from Tandy a mono cable to make sure that everything stayed central. And then I was making music with samples, purely with samples. I managed to get hold of some 909 samples. I could only play, I think it was 4 sounds at once. There was a severe limitation. But that was immediately when things started really opening up for me. I could not believe it. It was all of a sudden, it was another revelation, almost like going along to the underground clubs. And I started putting the ideas down. They were very, very primitive, but it was, I found my place where I could express some of the things that were going on in my head. And in some respects, I was learning by copying, because I was sampling. I was taking other people's elements, but then trying to do something new with them. So in a way, kind of remixing. So that was a starting point. And that was the point at which my obsession, my absolute obsession began. Now, in the meantime, the world was shifting musically and my life was shifting musically. I moved away from the building surveying world to another world which was equally as not well suited to my abilities. And at that point, I started getting interested in going out to clubs again. And that's when things were shifting. I was going to Love Ranch at Maximus. And in amongst all of the progressive house stuff, which is okay, and I have a very, very amazing memory of dancing on stage next to Bobby Gillespie from Primal Scream, having an absolute laugh with that guy. It was brilliant. And that was to all the progressive house stuff. But also the US, the New York sound started really coming through. So those mastered at work dubs, Debbie Gibson, One Step Ahead, that kind of triggered vocal sample with a soulful, deep kind of jazzy vibe was where I started to get that passion back. Photon Inc., Generate Power, DJ Pierre, Strictly Rhythm. It was this period where all of this amazing music started coming. So that really gave me my love for clubbing again. And also this coincided with the fact that the Ministry of Sound opened up. So we're talking about, I think, at 1991 here. I'm just going from memory. And what happened then was I managed to get there after some failed attempts. A group of us, some friends, all male, we tried to get into Ministry. They were very fussy with the picking on the queue. You didn't just get in. They would identify those that they wanted to get in. Of course, if you're a member, you can get in. We were not members and we wanted to go in. And 3 of us were picked. I was, thankfully, but the rest of us didn't get picked. So, as friends, we weren't all going to, split up. It was, let's go somewhere else. So that was my first attempt. That was failed. Now, my second attempt, I went with some other friends and some of those were members. And I remember going in there and going into the bar and just once again, it was another one of these revelation moments. This is like, I felt like this is home, right? There was no alcohol license in those days. The place opened from 12 midnight and then finished at 12 midday the next day. No alcohol. They had a kind of juice bar. You could get kind of frozen yogurt. It was very much modeled on the Paradise Garage, a focused kind of place for absolute hardcore music fans. And it was, in those days, it was for those that were really into it. But actually, in those days, also you had celebs, really famous people going there. And they had this kind of like VIP area up the back that was quite hard to get to, that was very interesting sometimes. But the first time I got into the bar, I was amazed. It was amazing. But I saw the signs to the tunnels to the box, and it said, warning, excessive volumes apply. I was too scared. I literally didn't go in there. So that was my first night at the Ministry. And it was really inspiring, because all of these sounds, these New York sounds, this kind of house, this new wave of house for me was very, very exciting. And it was a massive inspiration for me. So, I was working in a very dull job, but it was getting me money. I was saving up money and I was buying secondhand gear. I got a mixer, I got a keyboard, and I ended up getting a sampler, which is the Roland W 30. And that's really when things started taking off. So I was going to the ministry. I need to backtrack actually. That first moment of going into the box at the ministry, honestly, I was frightened because of my ears. I was worried about them. But I went in that room, and that literally was my new home. And I stayed in that room from, close to after midnight to literally to 12 midday the next day. I would just be in the middle, and that literally felt like the most amazing, incredible place on earth for me. The sound system of those days was purely analog, and it was remnants of the Paradise Garage system, the Richard Long system, that had been shipped over by Justin Berkman, who set the thing up. And it was incredible. It used to warm up about 6 a.m, and it would just sound like nothing you've ever heard. And so, for me, that room, the box, is one of the most influential places to me on this planet in terms of my music. So that was so important to me. And really, that's it. I started going to the members' parties, seeing DJs like Roger Sanchez, Todd Terry, the Masters at Work, all back to back and doing incredible things. The most amazing, amazing sets. And, this is the thing that spurred me on to make the music. And I had a very primitive setup, but I found that, the quality just wasn't good enough. And I was sending demos around, and I got to the point where I did get interest from, people, and got opportunities to then go in studios. And I was so naive. I had no idea what was going on. I was just, oh, wow, I'm just being brought into this world, So for me, I was surrounded by incredible, talented people. It was a whirlwind for me. I was going along. I just had no idea about anything. I had no idea about the business at all. It took a long time for me to understand that. But what it did was it gave me the experience of seeing how things were done on a bigger scale. And in order to get a decent sounding production, in those days, you needed a decent setup. You needed the big mixer with the good quality circuitry. You needed compressors. You needed all of the effects. I didn't have any of this stuff at home. So there was always this kind of raw, primitive sound to my demos that then became bigger and better if I went in the studio. So I did start to get opportunities to do other things. And then I got into big trouble with debt. I really did. I took advantage of, pay, installment schemes for pieces of gear. And literally I was addicted to buying more. And I did get to a point where things were sounding better at home, to a good enough standard actually to be mastered and released. But I was in trouble financially, and it was very difficult. It was, I got myself into a mess, but I was helped by a family member, and I would always be grateful to them for doing that. It just shows you that in those days you needed money to be able to make music. So I'm going to fast forward a bit, because what happened was, over time, the virtual studio technologies came, which meant that there were plug-in equivalents of the hardware. And so this enabled things to be done at a lower cost. And yes, at the beginning, they didn't sound anywhere near as good as the finished thing. And then because of life changes, I ended up, having to sell all of my equipment and stuff. And it was kind of perfect timing in a way, because I was able to continue making music. And really, it got to the point over many years when no hardware was necessary anymore. It was just a computer. And it's just incredible, really, to consider how much things have changed. And now we're literally in a world where anybody who has a laptop can put stuff together. Equally, now we're in a world where anybody who has a phone can make music and put it together. Lots of apps can give you all of the power that we had to be able to make music. So really, if you're wanting to make music, there's no boundary, there's no limits. You can do it. It's all there for you. It's interesting when I listen back to the stuff that I was making at the beginning, when I didn't know what I was doing, because I had no idea how to use a compressor. I kind of knew how to use an EQ, but I didn't know the finessed details of it. And all of this stuff I learned over time. And, I mentioned earlier about trying to gain knowledge from engineers in the studios. I would say that 90% of the engineers that I worked with did not want to share any knowledge. They were very protective of their jobs and their roles and their responsibilities and their knowledge. But one guy, Daz IQ, Darren Benjamin, he and I spent a lot of time in studios together. He passed on lots of knowledge. So he's another one that I would always be grateful that I worked with. And he did share the knowledge, because it really was not around. And it was, of course, only when the internet started to become a place of knowledge that I was able to then expand on things. And the other thing that really, really developed my knowledge was becoming a lecturer at Point Blank. I had a decent amount of knowledge when I started, but I soon realized that I needed to up that knowledge in order to be able to have conversations with people who are hungry for knowledge in a whole world of information that I didn't have before. And spending time with my Point Blank colleagues, they were able to spread knowledge to me as well. And so, I ended up kind of accelerating my learning and getting to a point where I picked up so much information, but the majority of it's still there. I'm lucky that I had that experience. So it really has been one hell of a journey. And we are heading into unknown territory because with generative AI, a lot of stuff can be kind of created without actually you needing to be a creator. You can put some prompts down and get some really amazing results. That will improve over time too. So I don't really know where this is all heading. In some respects, some of us have to lean into AI. It's an important thing to do, but how much you do so depends on who you are. I am very, very lucky that I have experienced the life that I've experienced and that I've seen so many incredible things happen and been lucky enough to have been in the most amazing studio sessions and see performers doing things and even working on 21-hour sessions. Daz and I did one once. It was incredible. It was crazy, absolutely crazy, working in a studio for that period of time. So I have lived a lot and it's all still there in my head, this experience. And the music making life, if you can live it, is one of the most incredible lives you can live. And some people have long careers, some people have short careers. My world is very different now because I don't focus on music in that way. For me, music's a hobby that I do in the evenings. I have a very, very serious day job, but thankfully it's in the music industry and it's in an area that I have great interest in, which is music and data. So I'm lucky, but I know this has been a long one, but I just felt I would just talk about a whole bunch of stuff, certainly related to the way that things have changed, because they have changed a lot. But equally just to pass on some kind of the experience, the journey in a way.